welcome to a Sparkination conversation. For those of you that don't know, a Sparkination is a spark that ignites passion that leads to action that changes what's normal. My guest is my friend from the UK, Richard Merrick, and Richard and I have been having conversations now for, well, I guess it's a year or more, Richard, isn't it? We've been having chats.
More than that. Yep.
More than that.
I think before the third lockdown here, so probably 18 months.
There you go. And we've valued them so much that we thought we might record one so that other folk can get in on what we've been talking about, which really centers around what I would call human being-centered conversations. And both Richard and myself, we host groups that have these conversations, small groups, usually 7 to 9 people. Richard has founded an organization called New Artisans. And we might start there, Richard, about what inspired a New Artisans and how are the conversations going?
Actually, and they're going well, and they've been a bit of a surprise. There was no plan to it really, and the way it started really was in a similar way that did you have your conversations right at the beginning of lockdown, the start of the pandemic. I was working with 2 groups. One end, if you're conventional business people, the stuff of data and evidence and productivity. And at the other end, the sort of depth psychology end, the metaphysical end. So I was working on with people doing things like psychodrama and constellations and psychotherapy. And what I noticed during that time was that, I mean, both of these conversations individually were really rich, but it was actually quite difficult to sustain a conversation where the 2 meet, because I think mainly because of the power of the home groups, if you like. Yeah. There'd be a conversation and people would get a lot out of it, but it wouldn't sustain, it wouldn't develop a life of its own. They'd sort of go on home at the end of the meeting. And that interested me. And so I set up, when lockdown hit, I set up Zoom groups. 50% of each, and scientists and shamans, if you like. And we met for 2 hours a week, every week, same time, 2 groups, one on a Thursday, one on a Friday, 2 hours every week. And what happened very quickly, which surprised me, was that it moved to a different place. Before this session, when people when the conversation wasn't sustained, there was an underlying thing that the scientists thought the shamans spent all day in a year smoking cannabis, and the shamans thought the business people were just finding new ways to exploit the planet. And what the regular conversations did was move them through that space into talking as human beings, to bring, as the trust built and the fear subsided, the necessity, if you like, to have an expertise, to be a persona in the room diminished. And so people started talking like they were human beings. And what I'd set up as a 2-month experiment is still going 3 years later. In fact, it's just about 3 years now. And out of that, as those conversations developed, there was never an agenda to it. So it wasn't outcome focused. It was just talk about what you're noticing. And a natural sort of topic developed from it, which is people's relationship with their work. It went through the other side of work-life balance, and then it got into, well, what if the work was my signature? Not just as a means of earning a living, or as a professional, or as a recognized expert, or whatever the case may be. What if my work was an expression of my soul? And again, it wasn't linear. It wasn't designed in any way. It just arose of its own volition out of these groups. So I played around with that and went back and looked at artisans in history. And if you look at every major sort of epochal change, and the most recent one, if you like, is the Industrial Revolution. You can take the American Revolution before that, within the same sort of, we're talking decades, the same sort of period of time, and the Enlightenment. The people who facilitated the move were artisans. Yeah. And there were 2 reasons for that, really. One is that the nature of their inquiry, they're artisans, so they're curious and they're always trying to find something new. That was the vertical side, if you like. And then laterally, because they operated the same standards, and guilds and things were an important feature at that time.
Yes.
They had a common language. Maybe not the language of the craft, but they had a language of attitude, and they were structured in the same way with sort of journeymen and apprentices and their relationships with the community. And so when things started changing, they were at the fore of it. And what happened then, as it got going, so they receded again back into the background. So in the Industrial Revolution, it was the artisans who actually built the machines that eventually not put them out of business, but took away elements of their business.
Yes.
The American Revolution, Paul Revere was a silversmith. Benjamin Franklin was a printer. And so there is something in there, right? The nature of the conversations that were had that facilitated this change in attitude, mindset, perspective, ambition. So it sort of rises up, a little alchemical, really. It sort of rises up, catalyzes a change, and then sinks down again. And I thought, well, that's sort of interesting, because maybe that's what we're going through now.
Yeah, I agree. I know something similar is happening in my groups, where we used to meet once a month. In my case, it was by necessity, because I have some medical challenges and my doctors told me I couldn't fly anymore. And this is 10 years ago.
Yeah.
And I thought to myself, what am I going to do? Because my life was centered around giving presentations to large groups and doing some mentoring for a small percentage of those folk. And I decided, as a practical thing, I'll just do small groups and I'll do them online. So it was a kind of a practical thing how I started. I didn't envisage how wonderful it was going to be, because what's happened in the decades since is that I've attracted, sometimes I don't know how, but people who are interested in the impact that they're making. They're interested in the meaning of their work. They're looking for more meaningful work in a similar way to obviously what your folk have discovered. They're looking for community. They're looking for places where they can be supported, where they can support other people, where they can live out loud, we say in my group. So we've been on a similar path. I made a lot of mistakes in the early years, but we've kind of settled in, and it surprised me, because now I've got 4 groups. 3 of them meet weekly, which surprises me. But they're keen, and the first group's now been going for nearly 3 years. Yeah, meeting every week.
And it's interesting, isn't it? Because they have a very similar path, and I find it difficult to identify them as mistakes. And we can do the normal thing about it's not a mistake, it's learning, but it happens to be true. Because what has arisen of its own volition. So when we first started, as people were finding their way into it, well, is this a peer group? Is it a book club? We talk a lot about what we read. No. What is it? It's a conversation. Then what happened that was fascinating, still fascinates me, was that in both of the groups, I mean, there are some really senior people with senior jobs. I mean, senior vets, doctors, people running large groups of practices. There's a big tax accountancy practice in it, or the guy who runs a big tax accountancy practice. And what actually happened as we got back in the groups, things were happening outside the conversation that had never been talked about in the conversation, but there were insights, things a bit like your Sparkination. The insights were had that people then put into action, but it was never designed. It wasn't this, the normal peer group thing of let's talk about your problem and we'll solve your problem together. It wasn't that. And then, there's nothing wrong with that, but it was at a different, I think probably emotional and spiritual and practical level.
Yes. Yeah, I've been the same. We don't have agendas either most times. We do have segments where I will do a piece about something, or I have guests come in regularly and they'll do a piece about something. But fundamentally, it's like a group of, old mates where we sort of pick up where we left on. We have women and men in the groups, which I think adds the nice dynamic. We've got people from all sorts of backgrounds. Some of them are like the folk that you're talking to, you know, senior business people. Some are self-employed. There's all kinds, but the focus is on the conversation. I was inspired by the writer and poet David White.
Yeah.
And he said, in leadership, the conversation is not about the work. The conversation is the work.
Yeah.
And that has always been sort of I was very inspired by that, and so were the folk that I work with. And so it's the conversation, and wherever the conversation leads is where it leads. And
it's fascinating.
I think it's the organic nature, isn't it, that makes this different to a peer group or a mastermind group or whatever. There's a real sense of community has developed, but it's kind of natural, it's human, it's real, you know.
And I think I find it's curiosity based. I mean, one of the things that's sprung off of this as you went through, I'm part of a group entirely accidentally, I'm part of a group in South Africa. So we meet every couple of weeks. That's full of young South Africans across the spectrum in terms of ethnicity, profession, locations, age, and they're a joy. But now what happens is that there's people who are in, if you like, my regular groups who are talking to people in South Africa, and so there is this. It's almost like mycelium. There is this interweaving of people talking one-on-one or small group on small group. None of it organized. It just arises.
Yes.
So the accountant I was talking about, he discovered, or what he realized was his business had very little to do with accountancy. That was the output. That was the process for which people paid.
Yes.
But what they were actually buying was the relationship. And the wide-ranging conversation about move out of the focus of how to be tax efficient into why do you want to be tax efficient? You know, and the conversations would start off with things like succession planning and development strategy, things that went out into sort of 10-year times, because a lot of his clients are landowners and farmers. So it goes on to a sort of agricultural timescale, you know, across seasons and much more forward-looking than a lot of the time that we spend in business. And that sort of permeates. So you end up with that, and then there's a conversation takes place between there and South Africa, or with, I mean, the guy I'm talking about, you know, because he's had conversations with you on your groups.
Yes.
And that feeds back into the regular groups. So there is this actually quite sort of joyous richness of conversation that is not about let's just sit there and commune. It's actually very productive. And one of the things we talk about is it is not at all efficient. If you were trying to have efficient conversations, you wouldn't do it like this. But what they are really effective because they touch so much more. You know, the questions that arise. We were talking the other day about evolving the question. You know, we're sort of brought up, aren't we? You know, to be, here's a question. Oh, I know what to do. I'll analyze it and segment it and apply these models and do all that sort of stuff. But it means that we're addressing the question as presented. Whereas a lot of the work is actually just evolving the question. Is this the right question?
Yes. Yes. Fascinating.
What are the questions inside this question that are asking to be addressed but not presenting? So it's
a bit like that the 5 whys thing, you know, where you ask five times. I found in lots of conversations that it's the 10th or 11th question inside the original question that's actually at the heart of it, and that can only happen organically. But interestingly, you know, because I get annoyed. Everyone's talking about growth and scale and all this kind of stuff. This is a kind of a different thing. It is scalable, but in a very different way, isn't it? You and I have talked about this, because what happens is, you know, I've got average of 7 people in my 4 groups, which is ideal, but they're talking to each other.
Yeah.
But they're also forming their own groups and they're interacting with other groups. And what I find when I've been able to join in your new artisan conversations, that I feel right at home.
Yeah.
because of the organic nature of it, and because I think there is a zeitgeist going on at the moment. Like you, I'm inspired by the Citizens book, John Alexander.
Yeah.
There's a lot going on. We are moving away from what he calls the consumer story to the citizen story. And so scale is happening just very differently to how we might talk about scale, isn't it?
It is. And I think I have to be careful with the labels. One of the things we talk about is labels are quite restrictive.
They are, indeed.
But nonetheless, we need to have them to start somewhere. But I think the thing with scale is that we have been brought up and educated this idea of industrial scale. I have a scalable business model, but it's mine. All right. So it's my model and I can scale it. Whereas I think the way that it really happens is much more biomimicry, is that if you form a really powerful, if a small, but like family, we've lost a lot of social contact as the Industrial Revolution has gone on. But if you have a small cohesive group, for just the reasons you're saying, they can talk instantly to either the group or members of another group, and the language and the tone and the feel is similar.
Yeah.
What you can't determine is the shape. So all of a sudden you've got these, I don't know, molecules, let's call them, but you have no idea what these molecules are going to make. So they talk to each other and something forms and you're just not in control of it. Nor should you. You can't be in control of it because you don't know what it's going to be. But if you take, what I'm discovering is if you take the ethic, if you like, and not the ambition, but the ethic, the intent, we'll use the word, the love. There's an energy to these groups that allows them to talk to other groups. And what arises out of those conversations is what needs to arise.
Yes.
It's difficult insofar as if you were trying to monetize it in a conventional way, and it's probably the least monetizable in a conventional sense group that there is. But I mean, income flows through it, but not in a way that is controlled or budgetable or forecastable or to which efficient. None of those things.
I've gone down the path of saying to people, you pay what you feel is right for you. And it's been highly successful. The majority of the people continue where they were before.
Yeah.
But which I half expected. I wasn't certain, but and half have sort of got all different things that suit them. Some people want mentoring, some people don't. That's private, bespoke mentoring. Some people don't. But that model that I've been sort of thinking about doing for quite a while, it's been highly successful. Not that I don't do it for the money. I do it because I'm working with folk as you are, who want to be the best humans that they can be. And it just so happens that, and in my case, I used to, work with people who their place in my groups was paid for by the corporation that they work for or the business that they work for, whatever. Now, 95% of my members of Wise Leaders Community pay their own way. The company doesn't pay anymore.
Yeah.
And that to me is a sense of their commitment to the group, but also to their own development, as a human being. And so we talk more about being good humans, and that flows into business and, other things. But I think, as you said before, it's all about relationships.
Yeah. I think the point that you raise on organization is an interesting one, because we've done the same. So I don't work with organizations. I work with individuals.
Yeah.
Even the word work sounds odd. Because one of the regular conversations in there is that we tend to go into, because of the way that the world of work is organized, we sort of we go into our workplace with a persona. We walk in there with not so much a mask, it's not artificial, but it is constructed. This is where I work. Everything from what I wear to the car I drive up in to where I sit in the office, all of that is a sort of constructed persona, behind which the real person is sitting. And I think what the groups have done, and to a large extent what the pandemic has done, is remove the place for those personas to turn up.
Yeah,
because there is no corner office on a Zoom screen, right? And the more that the conversation develops, the more people come out as themselves.
Yes.
And the more they come out as themselves, you look at it all of a sudden, and one of the conversation that comes up, and one of the questions sometimes is, how much of an opportunity does where you work and what you do allow you to be you? How much of your time does it consume? What is it that would make you feel, as though you were heading somewhere? And how much time do you get for that? Not in any prescriptive way, just to put it on the table as an observation. And that's a fascinating side.
Yes, that's been a hot topic in my groups, particularly as this hybrid thing, emerged. We've had lots of conversations, and most of the folk within my groups have changed their jobs. They've moved to another place. A lot have left their toxic bosses and found people that are interested in the human spirit and helping people to be valuable. So there's been a lot of shifting by lots of people, but in a very considered, organic way, with the rest of the people in the group supporting whatever that is. And so that the change really that was unplanned in the beginning has become a bit of a thing. One guy said to me the other day, "You have groups that helps people change their jobs." Well, that wasn't the intention, but it's turned out that it is a factor. Or people that are transitioning from working for a big corporate to working for themselves or whatever it might be. That's become a bit of the focus, but it's still around human being-centered conversations.
I think it is coming back to this thing of the new artisans thing. It's a bit like, it's about signing your work. It's about whatever we do people recognize the work that you've done? Does it effectively carry your signature?
Yes.
If you weren't doing it, would they notice?
Yeah, and we talk about impact.
Yeah.
Is this making an impact?
Yeah. And I have a lot of conversations with Ed Brenniger. I think you may have met Ed.
Yeah, you linked him and I. We've connected just recently. Yes.
He read a book called Circle of Impact, which I like a lot. But one we actually did, because of the nature of the groups, and most of us wear smartwatch things. So we ran. It doesn't classify as an experiment, but an observation. Which is, we said, okay, let's just see what happens. So when you're on one of these calls, and on one of our group calls, take your heart rate at the beginning, halfway through, and at the end. Okay? And do the same when you're in a work meeting.
I know what the result's going to be.
And it was quite astonishing, because actually, when you look at it, it's they're inverse U's. So the work one tended to be, your startup was quite high, it would come back as you got into it, and then as you got to conclusions and outcomes at the end, it would go up, because all the politics and things we think is what was doing that. Whereas in the sort of groups that you run and I run, people come in, and there's a small uptick as people get into the room, but then it really falls away. And at the end, one of the most frequent comments at the end of a group call, and the calls are normally 90 minutes to 2 hours. We have to stop them at 2 hours because
we only do an hour. But yeah.
But one of the most frequent comments is that, because we run them on a Thursday evening and a Friday evening, right at the end of the week, right at the end of the day, which you think is a daft time to do it, because we didn't realize how long it was going to go on when we started. But people's line is, it's perfect, because they leave the meeting more energized and more relaxed than when they came into it. The line is, it's a really good run into there's probably an aspect of, it's not meditation, but this thing about community, everything we know about groups, about heart rates aligning and all of that, there is something in there that when they're in the group, it's a bit like a clearinghouse. Okay. And I mean, it'd be a fascinating area to look at, to study properly. At the moment, it's just experiential.
Yeah.
But people really value it And in fact, an important part was when the lockdowns ended and people started going back to work, in more conventional ways, the attendance of the groups became, for a period of time, more sporadic, or people would check in from their cars. And there was a point in there I said, have these groups done their work? You know, there is nothing that says we have to keep them going.
No.
Have they done their job? And there was this real chorus coming back. Really sort of, no, we haven't. No, we're trying to get work, but actually we can't stop the groups. I think for that reason is that it's an area where people get grounded with themselves and with each other,
Yeah.
and the work they're doing.
That's a common thing. Grounded people leave the gatherings more energized.
Yeah.
People leave with greater clarity, and we spent that. A colleague of mine, Frederick Harron, a Swedish-based speaker, is Mr. Creativity, he's pretty much known as, but he says clarity is the answer no matter what the question.
Yeah.
And that's the I think one of the keys, that people leave clearer than they were when they came in, and that helps them in the rest of their lives.
And I think one of the things that arises from it, there are not just if you like, an intellectual level. It's not about the logic or getting the sums right or getting the formula to work. It's the liminal spaces. One of the things I've noticed on the groups is that we can cope. Silences arise spontaneously.
Yes.
Nobody feels the need to jump in and say something.
No.
So they will go for quite often 30 seconds, sometimes longer, just while people are thinking about or appreciating what's going on. It makes it sound all very wafty, and it's not. It's actually, there is deep sort of intent and thinking going on. When I was training years ago now, I worked with a woman called Nancy Klein, who wrote a book called Time to Think. And what I learned from Nancy with it was if there's a silence there, don't interfere with it. No, look at the person. If their eyes stay wide open and they're not breathing, then you should probably intervene. But if they're not, and you can see if they're thinking, leave them alone. And of course, we're really, particularly in the West, we're not particularly good at that. If there's a hole, we sort of
try and fill it. We once had a period that the silence went for 11 minutes. Even I was getting nervous because we're very used to silence in the group. But then probably the least most expected person in the room spoke, and everyone still talks about what she said.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of deep insights come from 30 seconds of silence or 11 minutes or somewhere in between. But that's just allowing the conversation to flow. I think the other thing that I know you're part of my We Need to Talk, where we also introduce another key element, which is about stories.
Yeah.
And in those sessions, I generally tell a story, and then I ask people to reflect on what they heard themselves say to themselves during the story. Because what I say is important, but it's nowhere near as important, of course, as what people are hearing themselves say to themselves. And that's the thing within the groups. I still tell stories in the regular community groups, but what I'm finding is more and more people are sharing their stories, and conversation flows on from the stories.
Yeah. And the stories evolve, don't they?
They do.
So the stories people tell about themselves evolve, and almost as though the telling of the story, it's a bit like the persona thing. You start off telling the story that you think is the acceptable version of your story. And then the more the relationships build, the more that story evolves and gets texture and color.
Yes.
Quite often the person telling the story finds places that they didn't know they were going to find when they started.
No, that's right. That's a wonderful thing about the deepening of relationships, is that the deeper story unfolds itself. and makes
Yeah.
itself visible.
Yeah.
And as we've talked about, this has been a recent thing. I think we're, particularly us male people that have been in business, you know, we're always looking for stuff, you know, wanting to make stuff happen, you know, all that kind of junk.
Yeah.
Thankfully, I'm almost over it, Richard. But what we're finding is that possibility makes itself known. We don't have to go looking.
Absolutely.
Possibility makes itself known if we're in the moment, and we're noticing, and we're open and willing to hear what's happening. And that's happening more and more in our groups, where, you know, as something will come up, and as Benjamin Zander would say, other people say, how fascinating, because that was not thought of before. And it's all because the conversation goes where the conversation goes.
And it's relaxing, and there are aspects as well in terms of sort of things we bring into it. So things that you wouldn't normally bring into a conventional work meeting, like poetry. You know, but they all have a purpose. It's about I don't know if we were using a metaphor, it's about looking after the soil. It's not about exhausting the soil. If we go to sort of a regen ag sort of metaphor. And it is that one of the people on the group talks about, she was talking about, people will conventionally talk about this is a safe space. And she will say, no, it's a brave space. No, it's evolved from being a safe space into a brave space, because a brave space is a space where you can try something.
Yes, I like that.
I think it's
still safe. It's safe enough to be brave, is what my reflection would be.
Yeah, it is, but I think it's safe as
not safe as in comfortable.
No, it's safe as a place to set off from.
Yes,
as against a place to hide in.
Yes, I like it. Yeah,
and so the people have taken to doing all sorts of other things. We all have talents, capabilities, dreams, all sorts of things that we don't get the chance to exercise or play with or experiment.
No.
And
yet life should be this way.
Absolutely. My wife's an early years educator who studied early years children at a doctoral level. And one of the things we talk about is the importance of free play. And if you look at the nature of our curriculum, certainly here in the UK, but it tends to be true in the industrialized world, is that we reduce the amount of free play. We start structured play very early as a route into, now you're going to do education, you know, now you're going to go learn stuff. And the free play is hugely important. I mean, have you watched young children at play, or even if you were one once, that whole nature of just working with, you know, just watch what happens. And we've sort of lost that. You know, we go in with these labels of I'm an accountant or a solicitor or a farmer or whatever. Back to the personas thing. And actually you're not. You're just a human being, you know. Had you been playing together at a year old, you wouldn't have been sat there saying, I'm going to be a solicitor. You just turn up as who you were. And I think the opportunity to turn up and experiment with that. And we've got people who found their artists. There's people who found their poets. In my own case, I started off writing as a journal, because sometimes I don't know what I think until I write it down. And so journaling, and then in a minor act of courage, I pressed the publish button and waited for people to tell me how idiotic it is. And actually, what I've learned, two things have happened. One is that I like the act of writing, and I like the creative aspects of writing.
Yes,
try to get what's in my head down on paper. And secondly, is that people have come back to me and told me that they value it.
Yes, I've been one of them. I think you're a brilliant writer, and for folks that are watching this, I'll put a link to some of Richard's articles, because I think they're deeply thoughtful, deeply insightful, and you've got a voice that the world needs, my friend.
And we all have. It's a question of how we express, and I think that's the. There is a thing here about encouraging misbehavior, right? In inverted commas.
Yeah.
You know, we all have this thing, I can't do that because people like me don't do that. Well, yeah, you do. Okay. The trick is, no, it's not a trick. You know, it's back to play. How can you do that? Now, if you watch children playing, young children playing, and there's something's not working, they don't do the same thing to see if it'll work. Unlike us, right? If the children are doing something and it isn't working, they'll do something else.
Yes.
And we've sort of, we haven't forgotten how to do it. It's just that we repressed it because cultures and accepted norms and things make us concerned about it. Yeah. So I think the work that you do, the work that we're all doing in our different ways, that fascinates because they sort of join up. You know.
Yes. Yeah, I think we're rediscovering a lot of unstructuredness.
Yeah. People are finding out, it's this thing of finding out who you are and having people say, yeah, actually you are. And actually, what's more, I can see this. Do you know you look like, or whatever? Okay.
Yeah, I think that's been a fascinating thing and I find it a great privilege to actually witness people finding out who they really are.
Yeah.
It's a wonderful thing for them and for everyone else in the room. And of course, great things flow from there. You know, we've got folk that have improved their relationships at home, improved their relationships with their children, their neighbours, their workmates, because of how they've been able to, in their own way, put in what they've taken away from the conversations. It's been interesting. I've been doing a series with my good friend Alan Parker. We're up to number 13, I think. We call them Conversation About Conversations.
Yeah. And
we've kind of had a different look to what you and I are looking about, what makes a wise conversation in our case. So it's been a fascinating journey. But I think your writing is really important, and I'll put a link, folks, so you can read some of Richard's great insights. Before we sort of conclude, Richard, what are some other things that you've noticed in the last 3 years that make these wonderful human being centered conversations?
I think one of the ones that stayed with me and is staying with because of the nature of what was going on with the pandemic, we were running these regular weekly groups, and people don't miss them. We haven't, even over Christmas and things, we have never ever not had a Thursday group and a Friday group. And when things became clearer, we sort of bit the bullet. One of the members is across in Ireland, as a farm over there. We all went across, and a dozen of us who'd been on screen, not an aeroplane. We all went up and spent a weekend together in Ireland. And what was remarkable about it was how unremarkable it was. Because it was almost as though you walked out of the screen and into the room, because people the biggest observation was, oh, you're taller than I thought you were. Because you only look this tall on Zoom. And it was, we spent 2 days together. And what was fascinating about it was that conversations like this would occur. You know, you'd be making breakfast together, and then it would trail off and you go for a walk, and then it would pick up in the afternoon. But there was this interweaving of these sort of conversations.
Yeah.
That had actually really quite a profound effect on people. One of the things that I'm looking at the moment and thinking about for new artisans, because we sort of centered it on, we think it's centered on craft, community, and confidence in who we are. So there's those three things we're exploring. And the one that interests me, well, they all interest me, but the one I'm looking at the moment is, what does community mean when we're like this? Because it used to be doing this would be a substitute if we couldn't get together. And somewhere along the line that has changed, which is it's not a default, it's just that they run on parallel paths that you can sort of cross, you can jump between the streams. But the quality of conversation from the outset, almost from when we walked into the room, it was just a continuation of this. when I looked at it.
I think we're designed as human beings for conversation and community, which is why this works.
Yeah.
Now it's inherent in our nature.
Wouldn't it be interesting if we could do that in a work environment? If you could actually say, no, we don't have to have the thing about the structure of the office, or you have to go to the office or whatever, but just actually understand it, who we are and what we're trying to do, so that it was seamless between.
Yeah.
It was seamless emotionally. I think that's the trick to it. Most work, there's an underlying side, obviously, of politics and emotions and all the other things, but they tend not to get surfaced so easily. Whereas in the work that we've been doing, is that is, it translates much more readily. So we haven't done this yet, but it's an area that really does interest me insofar as from a community.
I've got some of the folk in my groups are taking it into their organisations. In a couple of cases, meetings have been replaced with conversations.
Yeah,
and I think there is massive new artisan work in that space, because I think the workplace is undergoing a revolution like never before, and this is a part of it. I think central actually to it, because as I say, as humans, we're meant to have conversations and be a part of a community, because that's where we get our sense of belonging and connection from. And that's been eroded by social media and a whole bunch of other stuff, where we actually have lost the art of human-to-human connection. And yet what we're doing and what other folks are doing, like Jonathan in South Africa and other folk who I'll link to, we're really undergoing a regeneration journey, I think, to restore the proper human nature of things.
It is. It's as though I sometimes think it's as though we've put a constriction on our ability to communicate in the way that we've structured it. And one of the things that has happened during the pandemic, and well, not directly, but as a byproduct, is that constriction's been loosened.
Yes, it has.
That has a really positive side in terms of human-to-human communication.
Yes.
A lot of businesses, it's a bit of a problem, because it sort of comes up, well, why should I be working with you? Because the power relationship is, in a lot of instances, is changing.
Yeah, no doubt. Yeah.
And so if we have the conversation, structures can be conversation-led. Structures are fluid. So almost, I think, form follows function. And if you have good conversations, I mean, one of the things on the community side is, who's our digital community and who's our physical community, and how do they overlap?
Yeah, no, it's a good insight. Where possible, I've got one of the groups meets where it's a very much international flavour. There's people from the UK, from Europe, from Asia, from Australia. So getting together physically is, possible but unlikely. Whereas the other three groups, there is a way where we get together physically as well. We try and do that once a quarter, and like you, they're remarkable due to their unremarkableness, in the sense that there's a real humanness, there's a real sense of belonging. Conversations happen in the in-person ones naturally. I think at the end of the day, conversations enhance relationships, and enhanced relationships make the world a better place. And
I think one of the things that's happening is that fluidity. So, for instance, there's getting all the people I talk to together would be a major international exercise.
Yeah.
But actually, there's half a dozen people in California who I talk to who'd never met each other, who now have.
Yeah.
So they've sort of got together. And I think one of the roles here, it's a bit like moving the ego out of it. We are not the center of it. The conversations are the center of it. And if we can catalyze the conversations, then the people who need to meet will need to meet.
That's the key. Yeah, absolutely.
There is one of the guys, Dan, who I think is big Zen Buddhist guy. He's a contemplative psychotherapist. Great guy, and he talks about as being, there's an aspect of the monk about this, and I think there is that catalytic capability, which is a joy in itself.
Yeah,
it's just very, certainly to the way that I was brought up, and I suspect you know, as managers and leaders, that's not what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to do stuff, and actually sometimes just. It's almost there's the idea of putting the drop in the water or something, which is that actually it's not our job to do it. It's our job to cause it, to enable it.
Yes, I'm working on what I'm calling leadership citizenship.
Yeah.
If you Google global citizenship, there's a whole bunch of good stuff, but I like the idea of leadership citizenship, where leadership's the verb and citizenship is the noun. And we're having some interesting conversations about that, because I think we are citizens and we influence our own families, our own inner circles, our neighborhoods. I know I'm much more keener these days to get involved in my local community.
Yeah,
I've still got national and international connections, but it's more localized these days. But I think the same principles apply, that when we meet human to human, that's when the magic happens.
Yes, and I think that is at the center of it. I mean, there are sort of archetypes. There's the what do we do at this point? There's an aspect of the elder. There's an aspect, I think, of what we do in the trickster archetype. And the reality is we're discovering, it would be nice to sit here and say, I'm an expert at this, I'll run a course. That's just, you can't do that. And the only way that I think you do the work that we're doing is to start. And I don't think it matters where you are, or, there is nothing, you're not going to get a certificate in it.
No,
we're already human enough, right?
That's it.
And I think it's that little thing about taking that small step forward in company, and the rest will follow.
Indeed. That's probably a nice spot to round this off. My thanks, Richard Merrick, for a wonderful conversation.
I loved it, Ian. Thank you very much.